quite a automatic voice there. Anyway, so about the MBR, just briefly, we've existed since January of this year, and we're going to be releasing our first print edition next month, which we're very excited about. We're also online, which is moroccoboundreview.co.uk, and articles published about every week on a range of topics. Our content cover book reviews, think pieces, and international affairs. And we've been doing these MBR lives. So the last one was in April, and it was about Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, and it was given by Luis Monroy Santander, who's an academic in Bogota. And just a brief update on that, because it was a very interesting talk. And last week, Colombia reopened its borders with Venezuela after they've been closed for over a year. So this could see a rise in Venezuelan immigrants to Colombia following President Duque's granting of Venezuelan migrants as temporary protective status for about 10 years. So this really only just makes Lou's talk on that subject even more pressing. So if you missed that, that's available on our YouTube channel. And I just want to say thanks to Lou and everyone who attended for their really thoughtful questions.
But today we've got a very special guest, Dan Mendez, who is currently in Boston, Massachusetts. And as you'll probably know by now, he's going to be talking to us about Hegel, whose work he's been studying for over 4 years for his PhD at Boston University. I first met Dan in Dresden in Germany, where he was learning German in order to better understand Hegel's work.
And Dan first became interested in Hegel because of his influence on a man named Karl Marx. Marx studied Hegel for 6 years in Berlin, and he was a big influence on him. So we'll let Dan deliver the serious information, but essentially, what's new about Hegel when he breaks onto the scene is his focus on history. Hegel thinks that the only way to understand things is by seeing them as part of an irresistible march of freedom, truth, and reason. Hegelian theory suggested that historical progress would lead eventually to perfect human freedom. And this is obviously influential on Marx's theory, but Hegel has also been cited as the single most important philosopher to have lived.
Philosophy can be intimidating as a subject at the best of times, but Hegel, whose terminology has been described as repulsive, is an extreme case. That said, his ideas do stretch into current thought on nationalism, identity, and relationships to society. So that's enough from us too. We'll be taking questions from the floor after the talk, and a brief interview by mainly Lucy. But for now, let's hand over to Dan Mendez for his talk, which will last about 20 minutes.
Over to Dan. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, Elsa and Lucy, for inviting me. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about a subject near and dear to my heart. And I'm really grateful to all of you for choosing to join us tonight and think and talk about a very difficult subject, but one that I'll try to convince you is well worth thinking about. So let me begin sharing my screen here. You've heard enough about who I am. The subject of this talk is Hegel's theory of civil society. I'll be explaining what civil society is supposed to be in Hegel's view shortly. To give you an idea of where we're going in the talk, we're going to be trying to connect Hegel's theory of civil society to his attitude towards liberalism, which is a very important subject. We're going to be trying to connect it to the possibility of reading Hegel as a totalitarian, which is another important subject. And also to the influence of Hegel on Marx and Marx's rethinking of Hegel. So there's a lot of stuff to explore here. Let's jump in. Okay, here we go. Oops. All right. So a little bit of background. Hegel, who is he? Here's an etching of him here. His name is Georg Wilhelm Freidrich Hegel. His dates are 1770 to 1831. And he is the last great figure in the tradition of philosophy that we call German idealism. This is a tradition that runs from Immanuel Kant and beginning in around 1780 1781 actually, the publication of his first major work. And it runs through Kant's successors Fichte and Schelling, and it culminates, at least if you ask a Hegelian, it culminates with Hegel, who dies in 1831 and publishes his last work in 1821. Today, students of philosophy are mostly familiar with Hegel through his influence on other philosophers rather than through direct acquaintance with his work, although that's thankfully changing. People are turning to Hegel now and getting a lot of interesting ideas out of him. My own interest is mostly on the connection between Hegel and Marx. And to understand that, the principal text to look at is Hegel's 1821 work on ethical theory, The Elements of the Philosophy of Right. So one thing that unites all of these figures in the German tradition of philosophy is that they think of ethical theory, or a philosophical account of what kind of life is good for us and what we ought to do. They think of that kind of theory as fundamentally concerned with freedom. So their orientation when they're thinking about ethics is around the central concept of freedom of the will. Accordingly, this book, The Elements of the Philosophy of Right, is also Hegel's theory of the freedom of the will. He tries to answer the question, what is it for a will to be free? And under what conditions is it possible for a will to be free? These are all the central subjects of this last great work. To fill out the background a little bit and begin to give you an idea of what civil society is supposed to be, Hegel answers the question, what conditions are there on our ability to will freely? He answers that question in part by identifying social conditions that have to be in place. So the idea is that if you want to will freely, that requires not only subjective psychological capacities on your own part, but it requires that you live in a social world which you can recognize yourself in, which makes sense to you, and which gives you things to do, to put it simply. So in particular, he thinks that three distinct forms of social life have to be in place in your social world in order for you to be able to be free. These three spheres are, first, the family, which is what you think it is. It's the form of social life that we engage in when we get married and have kids. And the second form of social life that Hegel thinks has to be in place is civil society, the subject of this presentation. Civil society translates a German phrase, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, which, as you'll notice, the beginning of that phrase is Bürger, and you can see there a connection with the French word bourgeois. And that tells you a lot about what's supposed to be going on in civil society. In fact, Hegel describes the character who participates in civil society as a bourgeois. So civil society is, to put some meat on these bones, it's the sphere of enlightened self-interest. In civil society, every member pursues their own interest within the boundaries set by the personal rights of others. I look out for number one, and you look out for number one. No one is compelled to do anything other than to respect one another's rights in civil society. So this is, roughly speaking, society as envisioned by the liberal tradition in political philosophy. And I'll have more to say about that in what follows. So we've said that the family has to be there in order for us to will freely, and that civil society has to be there in order for us to will freely. The third condition that has to be in place is the state. which is, again, is more or less what you think it is. It's the seat of sovereignty, of sovereign power in political life. And Hegel thinks of it as a higher form of social life. So if in civil society, I'm a bourgeois who is concerned with my own self-interest and I try to flourish within the bounds set by the rights of others, in the state, I'm a citizen, Hegel says. And citizenship involves a different sort of attitude towards your social world. In particular, you have to think of yourself as part of something bigger and more important than yourself. If you're a citizen, you consider yourself less essential than the state of which you are a member. So in this respect, the state is similar to the family. In both the family and in the state, members are supposed to think of themselves first and foremost as part of something bigger and more important than themselves. But that's not the case in civil society. Okay, so let's add a little bit more detail here. What goes on in civil society? What does it look like? The first and most important component of civil society is a more or less free market economy. There are restrictions on this that I would love to talk about in the Q&A if you'd be interested. But for now, the main point is that civil society includes centrally a system of private enterprise where capital and the means of production are privately owned, to use Marxian language or Marxist language that Hegel himself wouldn't have used, but which he would have. That's how to put it in another idiom. So there's a more or less free market economy, and then there's a justice system which enforces personal rights. So if I take what belongs to you, you have recourse within civil society to a justice system. Finally, it includes two social organs that Hegel calls the police and the corporation. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. It's not that important for our purposes right now. So just to put a button on this initial discussion of civil society, as a whole, the activity that takes place within civil society is not guided by any single goal or commitment that's shared by the members of civil society. Everything that happens through private, unforced, self-interested decisions. I contract with you to satisfy my needs, and you contract with me to satisfy your needs. As I've already suggested, this form of social life that Hegel calls civil society is supposed to institutionalize the personal freedoms that the liberal tradition in political philosophy articulated and advocated. So in a way, civil society, the discussion of civil society is Hegel's concession to that liberal tradition, which to put a name on it would be associated with John Locke and for Hegel also with Immanuel Kant. But the state, as opposed to civil society, harkens back to an older, more ancient Greek way of thinking about the relation to your social world, where instead of seeing others as a means to your own personal end, you consider yourself as a means to the end of the whole. Okay, so let me pause now to just connect here explicitly with Marx and with the other interesting neighboring issues that I mentioned at the outset of the presentation. So Marx thought it was very important, a very important achievement of his, to have rethought the way in which civil society related to the state. So roughly speaking, whereas Hegel says that the state is a higher form of social life and that civil society depends on the state in a fundamental sense, Marx says that it goes the other way around, that the state, as Hegel understands it, is a kind of ideological phenomenon that really depends on the concrete economic activity of civil society. So if we are interested in Marx, and I think we ought to be, interested in Marx's, what Marx himself thought was an extremely important development in political and economic thinking, his correction of Hegel's theory of civil society. Okay, secondly, to motivate interest in civil society or Hegel's theory of civil society, it has been common historically to read Hegel as a kind of proto-totalitarian. And as I've already said, Hegel says that the state is a higher form of life than civil society. So there's reasons for this, and we'll go into this more in the following slides. But what I want to get across is that Hegel is somewhere between a liberal in the traditional sense and a state worshiper, as he's sometimes taken to be. That is to say, somebody who squashes individual freedom in the service of some collective, some social totality. So attending to Hegel's theory of civil society will allow us to see why it's inaccurate to read him as a proto-totalitarian, and why people like Stalin and Hitler, each of whom in different ways saw themselves as taking up, well, less so Hitler, but certainly some Nazis saw themselves as taking up a distinctively Hegelian point of view. I want to say that by attending to Hegel's theory of civil society, we'll see why those readings are very wrong. We can come back to that if we like later. So why would someone read Hegel as a state worshiper or as a proto-totalitarian? Well, to begin with, Hegel does say some really striking things about the state that give you the impression that the state is something quite awe-inspiring. For instance, he says that the state consists in the march of God in the world. And it's hard to interpret that in any way that doesn't make him come out as a, well, at least amenable to a totalitarian attitude towards the state. Secondly, he has a theory according to which historical changes can only be explained, at least certain important historical changes can only be explained by pointing to the actions of great men. And his favorite example here is Napoleon. He really thought Napoleon was quite cool. And this has suggested to many people that Hegel is, again, amenable to someone like a Stalin or a Hitler, a totalitarian leader of state who squashes the freedoms of the liberal tradition. Finally, the reason why people turn to, or people take Hegel in a totalitarian direction is that Hegel says some very harsh things about civil society. And so it can seem as though Hegel despises it and despises the liberal freedoms that civil society institutionalizes. That's what I'm going to focus on for the last couple slides of this presentation. So in particular, well, there are a few different problems that Hegel identifies with civil society. But the one I'm going to focus on is that the system of private enterprise that's central to civil society inevitably gives rise to inequality and to, at the top of the social economic ladder, a super wealthy elite, and at the bottom of the social economic ladder, a totally dependent class that's unable to provide for itself, given that the market does not afford them the opportunity to work for their own sustenance. So there's inequality, and beyond inequality, there's this problem that Hegel calls the rabble, or die Pöbel. Now, it's a bit difficult to get the problem of the rabble in view. What is Hegel saying when he talks about the rabble? Well, the rabble they emerge when the poor develop an unethical attitude towards civil society. That's what the rabble is. It's just a collection of dependent people who, because of their bad economic situation, develop an unethical attitude of rebellion against civil society, rebellion against the norms and demands of civil society. So, as Hegel says, they lose the sense of right and wrong, of honesty, and the self-respect which makes a man insist on maintaining himself by his own work and effort. They renounce shame and honor, and they fall into laziness and extravagance. So, as an example, he gives the Lazzaroni of Naples. I Googled them and I found this interesting illustration of some Lazzaroni playing cards and kind of hanging out. So why is this a bad thing? What is the problem? Why should an ethical theorist, someone who's concerned about freedom, care about this and make it a theme of their work? It can seem, for instance, that Hegel's just heaping scorn on the poor, but I don't think that's what's going on. He thinks that the rabble, in their unethical mentality, are actually responding intelligibly to their bad economic situation, to the fact that they are unable to support themselves by working for the market. So he says that every human being has a right to demand a livelihood, and he recognizes that contingent factors and external conditions can put you in this position, this disenfranchised, economically marginalized position. So he's not blaming the rabble for being in their position. He says it's not necessarily their fault. And moreover, their unethical attitude is an understandable response to their bad situation, even though that attitude itself involves unfreedom. As I said earlier, for Hegel, freedom requires that you be able to recognize yourself in your social world. And the rabble are unable to do that. To them, civil society seems like a cruel game that they're losing for reasons beyond their control. So let me conclude by comparing Hegel on this point to Marx on a similar point. Because if you're familiar with Marx, you know that it's central to his analysis of capitalism and communism that the system of private property and private enterprise gives rise to a special class, the proletariat. And the proletariat is, in certain ways, you can correlate it to the rabble as Hegel theorizes them, although there are important differences. What's interesting in comparing them is that they seem to see a similar phenomenon, the emergence of a disenfranchised, exploited class. Well, a disenfranchised class, and they interpret it in different ways. So for Marx, of course, the emergence of the proletariat is a sign that the system of private enterprise is doomed and that it's going to be replaced by something else, some other better way of organizing production and distribution of goods. But that's not how Hegel understands the emergence of the rabble. He doesn't see it as a sign that civil society has to be replaced by some other way. He has, I guess you could call it a more pessimistic view, that civil society's flaws, like its production of the rabble, and other flaws that we could talk about in the Q&A if you're interested, what they manifest is not that civil society is to be replaced by a better form of social life, but that the concerns which are given free rein in civil society, the personal private interests which animate civil society, are metaphysically subordinate to the concerns which animate the state. That is to say, for Hegel, what needs to happen is that civil society needs to be contained within a different form of social life, the state, where we come together in the pursuit of universal ends, and recognize something more valid than our own private interests, more fundamental than them. So I'll close with this line, that civil society presupposes the state, which it must have before it as a self-sufficient entity in order to subsist itself. And we can go to the Q&A now. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dan. That was great.
How did I do on time?
Yeah, really well timed.
Very well. Thank you so much. That was excellent. We won't clap, but we can virtually clap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I
Maybe
appreciate
we
it.
can go back to speaker mode if you or whatever it's called. If you stop sharing your screen now,
Yes.
and you can see your claps.
Oh, thank you
yes.
for the claps.
Okay. So I have one question which seems glaringly obvious. I'm sure other people are thinking it. How would Hegel have dealt with the coronavirus pandemic?
Okay, that's a very difficult question. You know, it's hard to. One of the interesting things about Hegel is that he thinks philosophy is extremely important and that it gives you essential insight into the world, but he doesn't think that philosophy can get you very far with particular details. For instance, he makes fun of one of his predecessors, Fichte, for saying that, you know, he could philosophically prove what has to be included in passport regulations. And Hegel thought this was just an obvious overreach. So you have to be careful when you're saying, well, this is what Hegel would say on a particular, you know, a particular social issue like whether or not to get vaccinated. But that said, my guess is Hegel would recognize vaccination as the kind of thing that civil society could demand of its members. Civil society can make demands on us, at least the demands that are in accordance with our own private interest. And so I think he would probably recognize this as a legitimate demand that you get vaccinated.
You think he'd have locked it down hard?
God, I don't know. It's hard to say. Hegel probably would not have approved of the idea that there was one procedure that ought to be in place everywhere, because he thought that variations from nation to nation made very important differences to which policies would work there. But I mean, I could certainly see it. Yeah. He actually died of cholera. So, or at least that's the story. So, you know, hindsight is 20/20. Maybe he would have dropped the hammer.
That's a good answer. I've got a question. So throughout your talk, I'm still not 100% on what civil society is, but you did a very good job of explaining it. But it does seem like it strikes me as being a very similar type of society that Hegel was talking about that we are in today. And I was wondering, I know you're not a historian, but I was wondering if you think there are any significant differences that Hegel would notice in today's society that would I don't know, that would be related to his thinking on civil society?
It's a great question. I think I'm an American, so I'll talk about America. This country is almost explicitly, it almost explicitly sees itself as civil society. It wouldn't use that phrase because this usage is kind of unique to Hegel, this way of distinguishing between civil society and the state. But if we can adopt this language, then I would say, yeah, the United States is basically almost explicitly conceives of itself as a civil society in the sense that it conceives of itself as a product of a free choice on the part of self-interested individuals. So how this country was willed into being by British subjects who conceived of themselves as free individuals. They didn't think of themselves as antecedently committed to any concrete common goal, like, for instance, I don't know, king and country. I guess that's a controversial way to put it. It's not as though these people were uninterested in the well-being of the country, but that they saw this as a country by and for the bourgeois. At least if my grasp of American history is accurate. So, and I think that some of the problems that you find in the United States, income inequality, just to connect it directly to the presentation here, you clearly do have this kind of problem. And it doesn't seem that there's any real solution is forthcoming here. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear whether you think that whether you think that there's more to public life in your country than basically haggling over personal private interests. But that does seem to be the substance of this country.
That's an interesting question. I suppose that makes me think that a lot of people think that say the internet as a new place of as the new forum or the, that's not the right word perhaps, but the new place of public discourse, I suppose.
Forum I would define that as
the ancient Greek term.
It's a place of public discourse.
Yeah. So I wonder what Hegel would say about that. But I think largely our countries are probably similar, although that's quite a sweeping statement.
Yeah. Well, he does see civil society as kind of a product of the English as much as of anyone. He sees sort of good English common sense and industriousness as like, the Germans love the English, at least the Germans I read are kind of fascinated by the English and love the English. And he associates civil society with sort of the virtues of England as he understands them, interestingly. He has a nice, interesting comment on English comfort and how the English have kind of invented this endless realm of refinement of creature comforts.
Such as what?
Oh, I wish he gave a better example, but I mean, I'm thinking of have you seen the latest, tea kettle improvements out of England, because just to connect this question to, the modern world, civil society is the realm of, today you mentioned the internet. If you pay attention to the way that tech people talk, they place a great emphasis on the idea of disruption and disrupting paradigms. They're really interested in undermining established ways of doing things and, in the process, making a fortune. That dynamic of constant change, constant disruption, that is very much a part of civil society, very much continuous with civil society as Hegel understands it. And so an interesting case to think about of the relation between civil society and the state would be to think about the way in which tech companies are or are not held accountable by state authorities, or are, on the other hand, allowed to basically dictate policy. That would be, so if we say, in this or that case, Google has dictated federal policy, that would be a case of civil society kind of inappropriately usurping a proper concern of the state. That was kind of a rambling response, but
yeah, no, that's interesting. I suppose that makes me think back to your previous question about America versus Britain. I suppose we definitely do have a perhaps more of a more state control. That's not really the right word, but yes, America's gone more down the free market route. Anyway, I feel I've asked enough questions, so I'm going to open up to the floor. And would you be able to raise your hands if you have a question you'd like to ask Dan? You can do that virtually.
Should I field my questions, or would you like to field the questions?
Oh, you can field them if you want.
All right, so I'll call on Sarah, lowercase s, who I believe is the gentleman with glasses and brown hair.
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's me, yes. Potentially confusing. That was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I have heard of Hegel for several decades. I was aware of him, but knew almost nothing about him, apart from some comment about Marx turning his ideas on his head or something.
Exactly, yeah.
And I was also sort of aware of the idea of German idealism. And I had a notion that it was something really, really weird and that was impossible to understand. So I think it's been great to listen to you explain his some of his thoughts in a way that I do understand. And it seems remarkably normal. It's not something completely weird and metaphysical and incomprehensible. But it did leave me wondering, what is this idea of German idealism? Because actually I don't know. I've never studied philosophy, and how does Hegel fit into that?
That's a great question. So I have to admit that there are aspects of Hegel's view that can be put in a pretty palatable way, where they are not, they don't sound so crazy, you know. But on the other hand, German idealism is a very strange view. It departs from most of the rest of modern European philosophy in a lot of ways, while also thinking of itself as a kind of fulfillment and culmination of that. So to try to put it in a way that the first great figure of German idealism is Kant. And Kant thinks that his fundamental contribution, or at least one of his fundamental contributions, is to distinguish clearly between things as they appear to us and things as they are in themselves. And he tries to clear up all these different long-standing problems of philosophy by just getting clear on this idea that you can talk about how things appear to us, but it's a different thing to talk about how things are in themselves. And so this introduces a through line that unites German idealism. That's the initial sense of idealism, is to distinguish between the way things appear to us and the way they are in themselves, and to be kind of skeptical about our ability to talk about the way things are in themselves. But that gets morphed. I mean, the way of understanding this distinction between appearances and things in themselves gets morphed over the subsequent generations, and it becomes kind of, by the time it reaches Hegel, it's sort of like a game of telephone where by the end, it's a little bit difficult to say exactly how the two ends of the story are united. But I hope that gives a kind of idea of where the idealism in German idealism comes from, and something of the unity of that tradition. Thanks for the great question.
No, thank you. That's, yeah, great. I will remute myself.
So Dan, do you want to take the next question, or shall I?
Yes. Actually, why don't you?
Are you sure? I don't need to butt in. Okay, well, let's go to Susie. Put your hand up.
Yep. Hello. I was just wondering about. Firstly, thank you. It's really interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot. I was just wondering about the relationship between civil society and the state, and particularly the idea that civil society needs to be contained within the state, at least to my mind, creates a kind of hierarchy. And I was wondering whether the two can like coexist in a balanced relationship, or whether there needs to be a kind of like hierarchy.
Great question, Susie. Thanks. So, to be clear, Hegel thinks that all three of these forms of social life that I mentioned, the family, civil society, and the state, are all going on at the same time, alongside one another. So I am a member of the Mendez family. I'm also a bourgeois who's looking out for number one, trying to make a living, get exposure and professional development through events like this, for which I'm very grateful. On the other hand, I'm also a citizen, and I have obligations towards my nation, my people. And yet, so they all are going on at the same time alongside one another. But it's also clear that there is, in fact, a hierarchy. You're right to pick up on that the state is the highest of the three, and it is it's kind of a culmination. The thing with Hegel is to see how he progresses in stages, so that as he moves from one stage to another, as he moves from the family to civil society and then finally to the state, he's talking about the same things. He's talking about freedom and our ability to identify with the world around us. But he's kind of shifting into a higher gear every time. And when he culminates with the state, he's reached something like the fundamental condition under which we can be free. And the reason why the state has this priority, the reason why the state is highest, is that he thinks it's in the state that we as a people determine ourselves to the highest degree. We reach the highest form of self-determination, collective self-determination, in particular through the passing of laws. So you're right, there is a hierarchy. They're all supposed to be going along at the same time, and yet the state has a priority over the others in that we achieve the fullest form of our self-determination in our political life. Hope that helps.
Great question and great answer.
Thank you.
So now can we go to Christian? I think you're next.
I just can confirm that the sound is okay.
It's great. Yeah, I can hear you. I think we all can.
I was thinking, I'm doing my thesis on around total automation, and lately I came across. I said, we have to go back to Hegel because he says something interesting about abstract work.
Yep.
And during your talk, I was thinking in this manner that maybe total automation is a realization of Hegel's dream, in the sense that the state is already an abstract construction that is beyond the individuals and beyond the collective. And that would be the, it's a rough term, but now we call it the AI because we don't have a better term for it.
So are you suggesting then, are you finished with the question, or do you want to?
Yeah. How do you feel about that? It's as simple as that.
So I'll begin by talking about what Hegel says about automation. You're right that Hegel has some interesting things to say about abstract labor, and that you can find kind of an incipient form of Marx's theory of abstract labor in the form of value in Hegel's discussion of civil society. It's interesting. So he was writing at a time when automation was only beginning, at least in the form that we would recognize it. In Germany at his time, it was not there was not a lot of automation going on. The Industrial Revolution wasn't in full swing in Germany at that time, but he was familiar with what was going on in England and familiar with accounts of factory life there. And he makes comments in his lectures to the effect that automation makes labor deadening, and that it leads to a form of human sacrifice. So I can find the exact quote, actually. I'm not sure, if you're familiar with it, then there's no point looking up, but he...
Yeah, it's in the philosophy of right. I cannot say exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, so he's aware of the phenomenon. He thinks it's a kind of a threat to freedom, insofar as through labor we're supposed to realize ourselves and achieve freedom, and he seems to think that automated labor is less good at doing that. And yet he also is a little bit optimistic about automation when he says that eventually the human being is able to step aside and the machine can take his place. So although in the short term there's this deadening of quality of labor, ultimately he seems to have kind of a creative destruction view of automation where, yes, that job will be replaced with a machine, and in the long run, if things go as they're supposed to, other jobs will open up. As far as total automation and the relation to the state goes, I wasn't sure I understood what your suggestion was. Were you saying that artificial intelligence might be able to serve the role of the state?
Of course. Yes. The idea is based mostly on Stigler's philosophy. If you're familiar with Bernard Stiegler.
Oh, Stigler? Okay, yeah.
His basic thesis is that now we're in a stage of if that's the correct term.
I'm sorry, Christian. You cut out there for a second, at least on my end. Can you repeat what was the Stigler point?
So the point was that now we're going through a phase in history in which even intellectual work is rules overlap the input of the individual, something like that. Now, if we go back to Hegel, the idea would be that on one hand, and this is the difficulty for me, on one hand, automation interferes in individuation, let's say, but on the long term, as you said, it can liberate individuals. So yeah, that's why for me it's a kind of a dilemma there, and that's why I asked.
It strikes me that Hegel sees the dilemma there too. I don't know what to say beyond that though, on this subject. I think it would be interesting to look in more detail at what he says about automation. But he's one of these people who seems to think that work actually really matters for us. And even to think that working for our bread really matters for us, that it's part of how we become free. So it would be, it's a difficult question how to think about doing that in a world where automation, is so prevalent. I don't, thanks for the question.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting avenue to go down. And sorry about the connection issue there again, but all seems to be well now. So let's go to Kevin. You've had your hand up for a while. Oh, sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to unmute yourself. Sorry, I didn't ask that before.
Stupid. Okay. Hey, Daniel. So Hegel believed if someone saw themselves as not just an individual, but a citizen of the state, they would feel part of something bigger and that'd be useful for social cohesion. What did he believe was the goal of the state other than to preserve its own power? And would his appraisal of the state rely on the state needing to act rationally and to the best interests of the majority of society? Because that's not exactly how we view the state nowadays, do we?
Right. So great questions. Thank you, Kevin. So insofar as we're citizens, we are concerned with the well-being of all. So we are supposed to have a concern for our fellow citizens. And that is a major motivation for our life in the state. So that's part of the concrete goal of the state, is the well-being of all. But I mean, ultimately, in the last analysis, what the state is all about is enabling freedom through the institution of rational laws. It is true that we could evaluate a state by saying that its laws are irrational, that it's poorly run, that the people in it are not well served by their government. Hegel is open to this kind of analysis. So I'm to turn to the second part of your question. But one of the tricky things here is that Hegel also seems to think it really, really matters that we be a part of a state. And so he's loath to conclude that a given state ought to be replaced or fundamentally revised. In general, he thinks that states, the way you put it, that they're concerned with perpetuating their own power, that's certainly true on his view. States are, and they have a right to be. That's how important states are. This is one of the things that's hardest to understand about his view, and one of the things that separates him from the liberal tradition of Locke, for instance, because Locke is explicit that there'd be no point to the state other than to protect my property. But Hegel thinks that the state really matters, sort of on its own terms, because it is the substance of a people. For that reason, he's not a revolutionary, although he did drink a toast to the French Revolution his whole life. It's a difficult subject. Yeah.
I mean, clearly you can't leave things to a purely capitalistic system. There are things such as the environment or public spaces, so certain areas that you need the state in. But is why he's so appraising of the state, is it because he believes in the role of being a citizen as fundamental to feeling like you're part of something more than yourself? Because I don't believe that should be done. I don't believe looking up to the state is the highest form. I prefer to look up to the universe or to humanity. To me, that is the greatest form of connection, because if you are too strongly attached as a citizen of your own state, you actually go against the betterment of humanity, because you can actually antagonize citizens from various states, just like you might have with an overly conservative or liberal American, for example. Wouldn't it be better to have one humanity, looking up to something that as a humanity we all share in common?
It's a great question, Kevin. Thanks for asking it. That position, wouldn't it be better to have one humanity, that one, let's say, global community that sets the terms of our lives, rather than having the United States and Belgium and so on? Well, that was the position of Hegel's great predecessor, Kant. Kant thought that we ought to and could work towards what he called a perpetual peace, where you've eliminated the whole idea of distinct states vying for supremacy, struggling to maintain their own power, and so on. Well, unfortunately, there's only a couple minutes left, and I can't really do justice to this point. But Hegel thinks Kant was wrong. And Hegel thinks that it's actually hopeless to suppose that there will be some universal government that would resolve conflicts among states. His vision of history is in some ways very optimistic, in that he sees us moving towards greater and greater freedom. But on the other hand, it can be very pessimistic, in that he sees history as an endless conflict among states. I think that's just how things are, according to Hegel. I wish I could say more on this issue, but maybe we can get in one last question. Thanks for those great questions.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I do wish we had a bit longer. I don't want to drag this out too much, but I will read out Jonathan's question from the chat, which is, would he see the role of the state as eliminating the inevitable underclass? So that's
Great.
the rabble.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, a great note to end on. One of the functions of the state, one of the important functions of the state, is to intervene in civil society and to try to make corrections for some of the unethical outcomes that civil society leads to, among them the rabble. So he does think that the state has this task. The state must address this problem. And yet, at the same time, he thinks the state has no extant means of doing so. So he ends on sort of a pessimistic note. And this is one reason why people have thought that what he might be doing is tacitly admitting that he bungled the whole job of creating a rational, not creating, but articulating a rational form of social life, because he was left with this hanging thread of the rabble and no clear means of resolving that problem. That's probably as good a place as any to stop. So I'll stop talking.
I'm going to stop you stopping, because Sarah, who's not Sarah with a small s, has had her hand up since the beginning.
Sarah.
So I should have asked you before. So let's have a final question from Sarah Lampert, please.
Well, only if you're sure it's okay and you don't need to.
Yes, don't worry. It's only 9:01. Go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks, Dan. This has been really interesting. And I think you really have succeeded in making Hegel, or at least one aspect of Hegel, a little bit more understandable to those of us who don't really know much about philosophy. But I just wanted to go turn to your German connection and experience, and I just am interested to know how. This is kind of maybe a question in slightly two parts, but how far is Hegel German, if you like, or how far did the fact that he's German make a difference to his approach? And secondly, how far did you learning German and being able to read Hegel in the original, in what way did that did that alter your understanding of Hegel's philosophy, or what additional insights did you get? Thanks
for those questions. The first one, that my answer to the first one is that, well, depending on who you ask, Hegel is either, well, nobody would deny that Hegel is thoroughly German. He is as German as it gets. He loves systematicity. He had ambitions for rank, which is, at least as the Germans of that time understood it, a characteristic German feature. and he looked up to the English. He had all of these classic German features. He looked up to the ancient Greeks. He's a very German philosopher. But he does also have the ambition to speak for everyone and to be a universal thinker. So there is this tension. And if you're like me and you have basically drunk the Kool-Aid, you will think that it doesn't really matter that he's German at all because he has successfully articulated, you know, what it is to be free today. So from my point of view, it doesn't matter all that much. And I wish I could say that learning German has made much of a difference, but Hegel is still too hard to read in German. Whether you're reading him in English or in German, he's very difficult to read, and maybe someday my German will get good enough that I'll get some true insights. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a good point to end on. And I would love to say thank you so much to Dan for the wonderful presentation and for answering all those questions. And we had some amazing questions, so much better than I could have come up with. So I'm really grateful to everyone who participated and for thinking about it so much. Yeah.
Me too. Let me just say one last time. Thank you, Lucy and Elsa, for arranging this. Thank you to all the everyone who asked the question. I really appreciate those. Were all really thoughtful questions. And those of you who didn't ask a question, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Also, thank you to everyone who didn't ask a question. Oh,
okay, I'm going to log off.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and you can stay tuned on moroccoboundreview.co.uk or on our Instagram, which is Morocco Bound Review, and Facebook and Twitter, etc. We'll be having another talk next month, so stay tuned to see what that is. And thanks so much again. It's great to have Hegel in a form that's accessible for everyone to discuss. So thanks again, and we'll be off now.
Clap.
Enjoy your evening. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Elsa. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye. That was great.
Goodbye.
How do I leave? Okay.